Hello, and welcome to the One Mind Meditation Podcast, a show about meditation, mindfulness, and your health. My name is Morgan Dix, and this show is brought to you by aboutmeditation.com. And today, I am thrilled to share with you my interview with Noel Coakley. Noel is a psychotherapist and a meditation teacher and the founder of the Boston Center for Contemplative Practice. In this discussion with Noel, we cover a lot of territory. And the first 30 minutes or so, we really cover Noel's biography. We talk about his own path, how he came to meditation, and the different teachers who were influential for him. And then we dive into a host of really incredible topics. Some of my favorite. We go into the topic of spiritual bypassing, which is something as a meditator most people should understand. It's definitely a potential pitfall on the path for all of us. And because we're both meditation teachers, mindfulness meditation teachers, we talk about the experience of teaching mindfulness meditation and how we came to that. Noel speaks very beautifully about the relationship between addiction and mindfulness. We talk about the challenges of parenting and how mindfulness meditation can really support you in that context. We talk about where Buddhist psychology and Western psychology meet, both in theory and in practice. And that's a beautiful thing about this entire show today, is we really move back and forth between theory and practice, between liberation and then the gritty work of the day-to-day composting of our experience, of our challenges, and of our victories. So I think you're going to love this show. I had a blast talking with Noel, and he is really just a fount of wisdom and experience. So I think you're going to love it. Before we jump into the show, I wanted to tell you about an upcoming mindfulness meditation training. It's called Coming Home, a 5-week mindfulness meditation training program. I'm teaching it, and in that course, it starts on February 8th, 2023, and if you're listening to this podcast after that date, don't worry. We are offering these mindfulness courses really every 2 to 3 months now, so you can check it out on our website at aboutmeditation.com. But in this 5-week course, we really go into the fundamental principles of mindfulness meditation. And it's an opportunity for me to share with you my 28 years of experience in meditation. I love the experience of sharing my passion for this practice with you. And during the course, you're going to learn all the basic principles of mindfulness meditation. We also really will meet together once a week to go in depth into a new principle in each class. And then in the mornings, we'll have short sessions. They're optional, but we will have drop-in meditation sessions every morning, Monday to Friday, for 30 minutes, where we can come together and sit, and I will lead a guided meditation during that time. So I really encourage you to take advantage of this offering. I'd love to meet you. I'd love to work with you. My experience so far of leading these courses is just incredibly inspiring, heart-opening. It's an opportunity to really, because it's a heart-based practice, it's really a beautiful opportunity to just drop into and inhabit that heart space on a daily basis and get deeper and deeper into your practice. If you're a seasoned meditator and you want just some fuel, if you want to meditate with others and enjoy that field of inspiration that we generate together by meditating together on a daily basis, you can get that. If you're new to meditation, this is a great opportunity for you to really launch your practice with a lot of momentum and just get some very solid foundational principles under your belt that will serve you for life. So check it out. That's over at aboutmeditation.com. You can find it on the homepage or just go to the courses section, and it's the Coming Home mindfulness meditation training course. Also, listeners of the One Mind Meditation podcast can use the following discount code to get an additional 20% off the current sale price. So that discount code is OneMind23. That's all one word. OneMind23. Just plug that in the shopping cart and you can take an additional 20% off the current sales price. That's exclusive for listeners of the One Mind podcast. So now let's jump into my interview with Noel Coakley. All right, Noel, welcome to the show, man. I am so glad to have you on here, and I've wanted to have you on here for a while, so welcome.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Morgan. I appreciate the invite, and it's just great to get to reconnect with you.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Awesome. You too. And everybody, Noel Coakley is the founder and owner of the Boston Center for Contemplative Practice. Did I get that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's a psychotherapist and a meditation teacher. And Noel and I met, like, kind of, there's layers to it. We both lived in the same area around Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. I noticed Noel because this was probably back in like 2018 or 2017, because, you know, he stands out. He's got this long braided ponytail and a beautiful beard. And it's like, who's this guy, you know? And I just felt like this attraction to Noel. Somehow I'm going to intersect with this guy. And then it turns out I learned that you were the director of the center where a bunch of my very close friends studied with Dan Brown. Right. And I was like, oh, okay. And I think I met, then I saw your wife at like the Wake Up the Earth Festival. And I just like, right. Yeah, I think I went up to her and I was like, I know a bunch of friends, you know, who are close with Noel. And then I think we met in Cafe Nero. I think I came
That's
up
right.
to you. Yeah.
That's right.
And then, you know, eventually this and that happens. And then we're on retreat together with Dan Brown. And he, you know, Dan Brown, for everyone, he's been on the show previously. He was a Mahamudra teacher, and I spoke about that on the show, and I highly recommend those interviews. And then my report on the retreat with him, that was very transformative for me. But Noel also was a student of Dan's for a little while, and then so, you know, we have this shared overlapping history, which is very rich. It's not that long, but in a short time, very rich. And then the final chapter of that was I was on his email list, and he was promoting a teacher training program. And I called Noel. I was like, hey man, what do you think about this? And he's like, I fully endorse it. I took it and now I'm supporting it, you know, as a assistant director. So, and then I took the course. So, you know, it's a rich kind of deepening friendship. And I really appreciate the work you're doing, Noel. And I'm so psyched you're going to have a chance to share your wisdom and experience with my audience today.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I appreciate all those. It's just neat how when you laid that out, it's like, wow, we do have a lot of those touch points.
Yeah.
Cool. You know, it's like, I guess we've been friends before.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, right. I definitely believe that.
Yeah. I appreciate that we're in each other's life, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, me too. And no, there was this sort of like little part of like the intimacy of you picking us up for the retreat each morning, like, because we all went to this we went to this little side parking lot outside of town, and then Noel would show up in his van and like kind of ferry like 5 or 6 of us into the retreat. And it always felt like that was sort of like this consecrating like threshold that we'd pass through, and being with you, and you'd have your coffee and we'd like kind of move slowly into that retreat. I love that.
Yeah, that was very sweet. We had a nice little crew in our morning rides there.
Yeah. Let's get into it, man. There's so many things that I want to ask you about, and we've talked about some of these things, but I love to start at the beginning. Just would love to just hear a little bit about your backstory, and if you could share with people, like, how did you end up becoming the owner of the BCCP? Like, how did you get into meditation? How long have you been practicing? A little bit about your arc in relationship to becoming a meditation teacher. What were some of the like significant events along that path for you?
Yeah. Well, so I guess I can go to the beginning first, in that I think I've pinpointed it down to this in terms of where I really first started turning the direction of Buddhism, and when I heard a song. And
Mm.
do you remember when the BC Boys used to do the Tibetan freedom concerts in New York?
Oh yeah, vaguely. Yes.
It was in the 90s, and there was one year that they put a recording together, and they'd pick a song from each artist, and they had on each disc for each day, they had opening and closing prayers from the lamas and the monks. And one of the recordings on there was a woman singing the Om Mani Padme Hum prayer. Yeah,
Mm.
Yongchen Lamo is her name. And oh my God, I'll have to send you the recording of it. And
Yes.
of course, when I heard it, I had no idea literally what she was saying, but I was like, what is this? What
Yeah.
is the woman singing about? There's something familiar, like something I understand in my body about this, and it was both heartbreaking and joyful. There's just something, I was like, okay, what is this? What is she singing? What's this about? And I remember I was about to say Google, but that wasn't a thing. Look up on the like internet available at the time, which was like America Online or something.
Yeah.
Typing in Om Mani Padme Hum, and not getting a lot of helpful information. But that's what started trying to figure out what this person was singing about. I was just so moved by it. I needed to
Mm.
try to understand what she was singing about.
Like there's
And that
a hint in the song, like a suggestion of something.
it was, yeah, it was a very direct communication.
Mm.
It's like so much music can be. It was really melodic. No, it was not, monotone type of prayer. It was
Right.
like a song. And not really any teachers available to me at that time or where I grew up. I grew up south of Boston. Everyone was Irish Catholic, culturally at least. Everybody was sort of wrapped into that culturally, but not particularly spiritually. That just wasn't, that's really part of the deal. That opened a door to like some sort of spiritual path. And I remember reading The Art of Happiness was the first book I picked up.
Mm-hmm.
That from the Dalai Lama. And it was like, oh, okay, innate goodness. Interesting.
Right.
A little different than the original sin message as I was
Totally.
taught.
Yes.
So just general concepts like that were like, oh my God. Or there are factors that lead to happiness and joy and ones that lead to suffering, like just laying out the cause and effect that
Yes.
I recognize about that. So all this really empowering stuff. I remember going to see the Dalai Lama speak once in high school. He spoke in Boston. Was just really moved by that. So that just kicked that off, and was without a teacher really until after college. I didn't really meet a teacher. It was just doing as best I understood, trying to practice from books, from things I read. And it wasn't until after college that I met Kagyu Lama named Sering Gundab.
Mm.
Owned a retail store, like a Buddhist shop on Mass Ave in Cambridge. And he jokes because he would just give stuff away all the time, and
Right.
the store closed
Oh
because he was
God.
like, all right, not so good at retail, but I'm going to stick with teaching. But he would have Sunday mornings, he would have groups in the back of the store, and there'd be a bunch of people, and he'd be teaching.
Was he a lama or
Yeah,
a rim?
yeah,
Yeah.
Lama. Not a monk, not a monastic, married to someone from the U.S., children, but I grew up in the East and was running stores and shops there, and got a good grip of the English language, and noticed he was doing a lot of teaching sort of on the fly, serendipitously. And then he connected with a whole bunch of lamas of many different traditions there, and ended up being a translator for a lot of teachers. So he would travel and translate into English, which, I mean, as you know, the translation, it's so important. It's,
Yeah.
not just a word for word, and often it can't be word for word, it's conceptual. So how things are getting translated really matter.
Totally.
So he had developed that skill set, and then come to the States, and but by those teachers, after developing that skill set, he became a lama, and he was asked to continue teaching and keep going. So he was the first teacher I had met with, and we would study like Dilgo Kinsei writings, and that was really the like proper door opening as far as really getting into practice.
Yeah.
In retrospect, I guess we can probably always say this as we move forward here, but like I was there for it, but also not ready for it.
Right.
I'm in my like early mid 20s, being an early mid 20-year-old, and so my eye was like on it, but not really, so he opened the door, but I wasn't really ready to walk through it entirely, if I'm to be honest.
Yeah, right. Yeah, a lot of conflicting aspirations and impulses at that age.
Yeah, for sure. That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When was that? Was that like the early aughts or late aughts?
Yep. Yeah, I finished college in 2003, so this is like maybe a few years after that.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Yep. He's now a chaplain at one of the hospitals here in Boston of Beth Israel. So, helping people when they're sick and dying, and doing amazing work with that.
Nice.
And he's taught at the center a bit, and we've remained friends and remained connected. But he was yeah.
Well, I have a question about that. Like, so in terms of what you were describing, in the sense of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, not necessarily being like he opened the door, but maybe you weren't quite ready at the time.
Yeah.
Did you have any experiences with him, like insights or openings that made you feel like, oh yeah, this, I'm meant to be here. Like, this is part of what I'm looking for. Was there something that happened? Yeah.
Well, I think that was both the recognition, the way you just said it, and probably what freaked me out.
Right. Yeah.
He is just the sweetest guy. Absolutely. You feel that unconditional loving space around him. He doesn't really have to say a word, and there's a way you can just relax around him, which is both amazing. And when that kind of being is also unfamiliar, that can also be horrifying.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So I couldn't have articulated this at the time, but now looking back, there was just like I started distancing myself a little bit, or just not connecting as often. I think that's what it was. Like I wasn't quite ready for that kind of space.
Yeah.
Wasn't there yet, know?
Right.
And that took a little bit more time, healing in ways that made it okay to be in that space.
Hmm.
I think I can still credit those moments for kicking that off. Even that strong reaction to all that is kind of start to cause an effect chain of like, oh, okay, there's that. That's always in the back of your head. Like you can't unknow that.
Right.
So I kicked it down the road a bit, but it was still in the back of my head. Like we're gonna have to come back around to this.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
This isn't going anywhere. So
yeah. So then where did you go from there?
Yeah, well, so at the time I was also, I was a school teacher. I was teaching special ed, and I started switching gears after doing that for a few years, just recognizing I was more relationally focused than educationally focused per se, and switched it up to go to school to be a psychotherapist. So around that time, so now I'm going to school for that, which was very process our own stuff oriented.
Yeah.
There was no hiding theoretically. We just had to get in it. So I'm doing that. I'm in therapy myself. I'm in now a loving relationship with now my wife, but at the time, just getting to know her. I am doing a yoga teacher training where I'm reconnecting with the body, and from a bunch of different angles, healing is starting to happen. Reconnecting with myself, opening up to that kind of space, coming sort of back home to myself in all those ways we kind of disconnect from ourselves, and then all the things that come of that disconnection, those things started to kind of unravel a bit, all together at the same time. So as that's all happening, shortly after I ended up meeting Dan. So I mean, also, just mention this in my sort of healing and recovery process. I quit drinking right before I met Dan. This is now a little more than 9 years ago.
Yeah.
And, I know that was a pattern that had built up in my life as an unhealthy coping strategy,
Right.
and, my experience wasn't like an everyday all the time sort of thing, but, I could draw a clear through line to all the times I acted in ways that were out of alignment or I regretted things. It was like, well, that's the common denominator there.
Yeah.
So 9 years ago, I had my first child, and this is just before also meeting Dan, and right after I stopped drinking, like everything was starting to like click together, sort of rapid fire.
Yeah.
It was just enough, like, okay, reconnected with the body, reconnected with emotional spaces, reconnected with healthy relationships. It was okay to let that relationship go at that point,
Yeah.
and that's when I connected with Dan the first time.
Dan Brown. Yeah.
Dan Brown, yeah. I actually landed on one of his programs. I needed continuing ed credits for psychotherapy, and I was working at an outpatient mental health clinic. I was in charge of running the groups, and at that time, I was having a tough time successfully pitching the idea of running a mindfulness-based or yoga-based, a movement-based therapy group. It just wasn't flying with the people I was working for. And he had a continuing ed program through Harvard Extension School, and it was teaching meditation geared towards mental health and medical practitioners.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, this is great. This is going to be right in that language wheelhouse. I really took it thinking like, what I'm going to learn is how to talk about this to the people that I'm going to need to pitch it to.
Yeah.
Right. That was my intention going into it. After introducing himself the first day, he was like, well, so this is about awakening, and that was just like a pan to the face, It's like, I didn't know I wanted to hear that, but it was like, oh my God, that's okay. You've got my attention. I'm here.
Totally.
And there was this skill set in moving from like this, PowerPoint oriented factual information about Western science on meditation to, by the midweek, we're talking about the elephant path and everybody's sitting on the floor seamlessly. And the room I happened to be the only therapist in the room. Everyone else happened to be physicians of some sort. And the skill set of moving from that kind of way of talking about things into a very traditional way of talking about things was pretty seamless. And so I was lighting up at that. And
yeah.
I was like, I got to learn from this person.
Yeah.
So that's how that relationship started.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. And that was a lot less common then, because, I mean, a lot of this was coming online, but people who could move so seamlessly like Dan did.
Yeah.
Between those two worlds, even in 2019 when I took the retreat with it, or 2020 when I took that retreat with him, I mean, I'd never experienced anyone just so fluent and fluid between those two modalities, like those two worldviews, really.
Right. And just to lay that out for folks listening, if they're not familiar, I know you had him on the podcast.
Go for it.
He's a Western psychologist. That was his sort of academic path, and then learned from the lamas as well. So when we say kind of mixing that language, that he would get into Western psychology and use that language, or use academic-ish language, which often for us culturally is like the way we need the buy-in.
Right.
We just hear it justified that way or something. Maybe less so these days, even since then, right?
Yeah.
Probably that's shifted some, but probably that's still true on the whole. So he was coming from that background.
Yeah.
Had some teachers from a few traditions. So just being able to introduce that stuff. And he's a translator too. So back on that topic again, he could translate text and talk about the concepts directly.
Yeah. So with Dan, like, did you find that, so you studied with him for what, like 6 to 8 years?
That's right. Yeah. I was going to say 7-ish, something like that. Maybe 7 or 8 years. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And what, yeah, go ahead.
Well, after that continuing ed, I was finding out, what else he was up to, and ended up at a retreat at what was then Samadhi.
Right.
So that's how I got connected with that physical space, which
right.
I, as you know, ended up ended up taking over. But they, I found out they also had offices there. I needed an office for doing psychotherapy. And I was like, after having a positive experience at the retreat, I was like, oh, I can rent an office here and just hang around. This is cool.
Totally.
So that's how I ended up over there.
Yeah, and everyone, that samadhi was owned by John Churchill. So and we had yes, and we've interviewed John on the show too. So and I highly recommend that episode. It's really great.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah.
Yes.
He was, Dan, as you know, I mean, we've both been in those retreats together. He's got a skill set of, conveying practice instructions. I think that was, overall sort of the biggest. A lot of takeaways from the relationship.
Yeah.
Very crystal clear. It was coming from Mahamudra, which my understanding is compared to a lot of particular traditions or schools, like that has a lot of detail around practice.
Yeah.
Direct practice instructions.
Yeah.
Little tips, little tweaks, little things that just dial in and put language on experiences that are tough to put language on.
Right.
So he was good at that. And I think that was really learning the step-by-step logic of how to approach it, plus the language of how to introduce it, while peppering in that Western psychology and seeing an example of that. It was just, I'm very grateful for that relationship and for that example from him.
Me too.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
He also, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
He opened up the Bun world, in terms of connecting with people too. So that's, I guess, when I think about the through line and the teachers I'm connected with now, it was because of his connections and meeting people in the Bun world that I am now connected to that. And just to share, that's one of the schools. It's technically not a school of Buddhism, right?
Right.
But it's still in the family, it's now the Dalai Lama recognized it as, another equally valuable lineage tradition from Tibet. But for a while, it was kind of seen separately. At the end of the day, the practices are all ultimately similar in getting at all the same stuff. And somewhere along the line, they mixed in the waters with Nyingma Dzogchen, and the Bonpo will say, no, that came from us. And the Nyingma Dzogchen will say, no, that came from us. And it's like, it kind of doesn't matter to me, but they all crossed paths and amplified and helped one another articulate things. And they're fairly similar in that a major difference I'd say about Bun and other traditions is that they also have another side, which we might say is like the shamanistic side.
Yes. Right.
Right. So there's that whole side of that lineage, and it predates Buddhism in Tibet and was throughout a kingdom called Zhangzhung that went all the way through like the Middle East. It was pretty big. So it's got a long history.
Well, and wasn't it like I seem to recall Dan framing it also as like it was the original religion, and it was the original indigenous kind of tradition in Tibet before Buddhism, and that's why also like a lot of the Bon deities, wrathful deities, stuff like that. A good number of those come to us from Bon. Is that right?
That's my understanding as well. Yeah, and there's, sometimes you hear the distinction between Bun and Yungdrung Bun, and Bun is sort of like a general term. Sometimes it's even used pejoratively, like, oh, that's just Bun. Like, you'd hear that from other schools of Buddhism saying like, oh, that's just sort of like these savage practices over here. Like that's just Bun. So sometimes you read that word and it's like a general and pejorative term, or just a general way to name a lot of different types of shamanistic practices from a lot of different places that like sometime back in history weren't really tied together. Right. Then there's what they call Yungdrung Bun, which is more organized, which is more like the schools of Buddhism that, we might understand from the other schools, that there's the Sutra and Sakta Dzogchen paths, and, they've got their lineage of Buddhas, they've got their lineages of texts and things like that. Right. So sometimes they just use the word Bun, but sometimes you'll see that distinction of Yungdrung Bun is what we learn now, and then Bun could be this more generic term for like all the different things that existed prior to Buddhism in Tibet.
Yeah. Gotcha. That's helpful. All right. So then, okay. So there's the Dan Brown chapter, and then do you want to say anything more about your time with Dan before we move to David?
No, other than, again, if there's just a lot of different types of things learned from watching him teach. His style of teaching was something to be learned from. The directness and specificity of the language, and it was all just a big door opener. So I'm grateful for that time with him.
Mm-hmm.
And it just opened up that Mahamudra and Dzogchen world.
Yeah. I mean, it was one thing that always stuck out to me, and this was maybe against the backdrop of my own experience with Andrew Cohen. Dan would have this, I don't know if it was a measurement, but he would talk about how many of his more senior students were stabilized in awakening. And coming from Andrew, and Dan would like ground that in these sort of in research and studies, and these sort of, I guess they were qualitative, like surveys and research. And I always found that interesting and compelling because, like, our community broke down in some measure because Andrew wouldn't ultimately let go of control and empower his own students. And tied to that was this idea that they weren't established in the same place that he was. And I think a lot of teachers struggle with that, and some lineages are more tight around that, some are more open around that, and that's a whole separate conversation. But I did find that interesting that he would really point to, like, have all these students who are really established at 90% awakening or whatever, and that's their kind of center of gravity. Like, what did you make of that? Like, I'm curious.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah.
Really. I think the great takeaway about all that was sort of just this empowering and confidence building of, look, you can do this.
Yeah.
And let's look right at the limiting beliefs that might come up for you around why you think maybe you can't, or others have done this or something, or what separates you from the others, and sort of recognizing that commonality of Buddha nature for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, you can do this. And look, there are steps for this, and there are ways this has been taught, and thousands and millions have done this before. So I think that's the upshot of that. I think it could also veer into, there's the danger of keeping a little bit too much score on all that.
Yes, right.
And getting a little bit caught on that. And I think that has the potential to draw in people who are going to be seeking special states and who are gonna, there's a fine line between, like, okay, these are serious students versus people just seeking, like, oh, this is the good stuff. Like, this is the, this is the secret sauce. Like, this is I'm going to be awakened now. And there's something to that. Chogyam Trungpa calls it spiritual materialism. That I think keeping tabs on it like that and sharing that inevitably, regardless of the intention, has the outcome of creating spiritual materialism.
Okay. All right. So this is a topic that I want to actually go into with you, the whole context of spiritual bypassing. So let's get to the end of your biography here, and then we can go into that, because that's come up.
Well, I hope today's not the end, but
current. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, a few other teachers relative to this context.
Yes.
Two teachers that come to mind that I definitely want to mention are David Nickturn and Geshe Gelik. And David and I connected when I was running the center. I've got experience organizing people and pulling people together around a common purpose, but not really a lot of business experience, right? So I was talking to a friend named Beck Conan, who runs a company called OM106, and she's a midwife and a birthing
Right.
coach.
You're doing a course with her.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. We're doing a course for parents. And I was talking to her and I said, look, I don't know what I'm doing here when it comes to running a business. And there's a lot for me to learn. And, I need some advice, but I also need that advice coming from at least a similar orientation on value system and what's important. And there's a lot of advice on, how to make a lot of money. And there's nothing wrong with that. I actually needed to learn how to deal with being okay with money too. But, the just sort of only oriented towards bottom line advice, I think there's plenty of out there. And that's not what I was looking for. So she was like, you got to talk to David. This is the guy who, really can connect Dharma and how you're making a living. He has since written a book, Creativity, Spirituality, and Making a Buck. He hadn't written that at the time, but, so that's how I first connected with him, was looking for business advice, but something that wasn't going to be contradictory to to the value system,
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the initial connection, but it became clear pretty quickly that he was another teacher for me, and just in this very grounded, down to earth way is able to weave principles from Buddhism just right into everyday life, like really bring it down to earth. Like let's use this to think about how you're approaching your business. Let's use this to think about how you're thinking about your skill set or where you need help. And so it was great in that sense. Again, I thought it was just going to be business advice, but it just very quickly turned into like, oh man, this guy's great. Like, he knows how to tap into creative mind space. He knows how to teach Dharma in this really down to earth, how are you going to get the permits tomorrow way,
Yeah. Yep.
And, started connecting with him, and he was offering the mindfulness meditation teacher training that you and I have both taken at this point, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And I did the last one that was in person before the pandemic, when they were doing them at Tibet House in New York City. And that was a huge, I just found it, and maybe you found this the same, I was really freaked out at the idea of doing any sort of teaching.
Yeah.
The message, whether it was like how it was delivered to me or how I misunderstood it or whatever, or there's probably also some convenience in just like hiding behind this, but like, it's like, man, like, gotta respect lineage. It's really bad if you say stuff you're not supposed to say. Like, that's bad. Don't be arrogant. Who do you think you are? Right.
Oh yeah.
And there's such a depth to that world that it's intimidating. You feel like you can never know the whole field there. So it's like, who am I to talk about any of this stuff?
Right.
And David, through that teacher training, has a skill set of being very clear about isolating particular skill sets or practices. And in that case, it was mindfulness, and saying like, look, we can dial in on this. We can have clarity on what we're doing and what we're not doing, know for ourselves what the boundaries and limitations are of our skill set, and really stick to that, and then be confident about that. And that lit some things up for me big time. That just opened, like, just that kind of confidence to be like, okay, look, if I'm just clear with myself on, I'm good on this knowledge base, not so much on these, like, just kind of stick to the lanes where I'm comfortable, and I keep learning as a student, and have people I can check in with and that will check me. This is not only okay, but important.
Yes. Yeah.
Not just not bad, but something that should be done.
Totally.
And Geshe Gelik, who is the Bon Lama that I've been meeting now with for a number of years, has also been really encouraging on that front. He takes this approach of like, look, you're not supposed to be the end point on any teachings you receive. That's almost selfish in a way. Yeah, doing it in the right context is really important. Like, it's not just, you don't just bring it up whenever or wherever, but when someone asks, the better you are equipped to respond skillfully, the more loving that is, and you have an obligation.
Yeah.
So those two teachers in that way have I owe a debt of gratitude to them for the confidence in being able to offer things to other people that feel helpful.
Yeah.
And be okay with my own limitations, but confident with what I can do.
That's awesome. And I do resonate with that. I mean, the tradition I came from, my teacher, unless you were firmly established in what he would call the awakened state, which, by the way, he was the kind of sole arbiter of that, and he was not gonna, he really was reluctant to empower people. It turned out that was not a wholesome position really for him, because a lot of his students were extraordinary people, like just extraordinary people who had been serving in that context for 30 years and were clearly like lit up by the teachings and could transmit and communicate that in very powerful and innovative, novel ways. And, that was threatening for him. But I internalized a lot of the same sort of scripts that you were describing. So it was helpful, certainly, with David, because in that teacher training, because he just had such a light touch, as we were talking about before. Yeah. He brought so much humor. And with that humor and that light touch, these, as you again spoke to, just these super clear guardrails to the whole thing. Like, hey, stay within your lane and you're good. Just, you'll be fine. You teach what we're talking about and we're instructing you on. And then for me, it was also like, having been in a more or less a monastic context for 14 years, I was just dying to share my love and my passion for practice in a way that was different than like a canned course or even the podcast. It's been so transformative and so meaningful and so purposeful for me, that practice, that having even that simple certification, it's just like a vehicle for being able to share on a much deeper level in a teaching context. So yeah, I really, I'm grateful to David for what he's doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just again, that confidence and the opposite of that being threatened that you mentioned earlier, and I think that thing comes out of, you can lean on the lineage will be mad sort of thing to hide your feeling threatened by other people teaching. And from opposite of that, you get David being like, look, there's a lot of people who want to learn about this. There's just no shortage of people who want to learn about this. Like, we need as many people doing this as possible. And the more the merrier. And nobody's for everybody. So even better that all the different personalities and styles of people that are coming together to have their own flavor on this.
Yeah.
To be there for different people. So it's just, I think we both got a nice, cool drink of water.
Oh, yeah.
Relationship.
Absolutely, man. All right. Well, let's talk about spiritual bypassing. Because again, that's a topic that, as you said, David has been a good countervailing kind of influence for you in that. And for me, one of the critiques of my path and practice when I was in that Neo-Advaita school, from the whole Ramana Maharshi lineage, a lot of the criticism of the teaching I was in and our community, and this came a lot from the integral world, was like, hey, that you guys are doing a lot of spiritual bypassing. And I kind of was like, we had kind of a superior attitude to that. But then afterwards, I was like, yeah, I think that's really true. But it wasn't really until studying with David and doing basic mindfulness that suddenly I was like, wait a second, there's something here that I think I intellectually understood. But then when I started to do that practice, I was like, oh God, I was like, this goes really deep, and we can define the terms in a moment, but spiritual bypassing, it suddenly became really clear. And then I took Ethan Nichtern, David's son's 3-month course on spiritual bypassing and emptiness and Tonglen, and man, that illuminated the whole thing for me. So I want to hear your perspective on spiritual bypassing, but like first we can maybe define it. And I want to talk about it because it's been transformative for me to identify it. Mm-hmm. And also just because of the particularities of my path, it was just very relevant. Because we live in a materialistic culture, as you alluded to, I think it's relevant for Westerners in general. But spiritual bypassing, as I understand it, and there's a lot of dimensions to it, which would be good to unpack, but it's this idea that when we sit down to practice, in basic mindfulness, we learn that by focusing on the breath and coming into the present moment with a non-judgmental attitude, we are just attending to everything that arises in our experience, right? It's a completely democratic attitude. We're just there with life arising. And that's the practice, right? We're just sitting with what is, and we're bringing a friendly and curious disposition to that. Now, in my practice, we had which was this sort of Advaita lineage. We had this no relationship practice where when we sat, we didn't have a meditation object like the breath. It was just sit, be still, relax, and have no relationship to anything that arises. And there was a subtle proclivity or predisposition towards going for these higher states, really just free falling and letting everything go, And one of those signposts or signals to indicate, you're really in that deep let go state was that, you'd have all these special experiences of like just very profound and exquisite stillness, mm-hmm. or just these, where you're just soaring, right? You're mm-hmm. just empty, and everything just passing through you, and it's everything that touches you is ecstatic. And it became like that was a lot of the orientation of our practice. And over time, like you experience that enough, it becomes, I think, quite naturally, maybe even habitual to orient to that as being the point of the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And in the process, like finding that all the uncomfortable stuff that comes up, like both in practice and in my daily life, the rage, the confusion, the self-consciousness, the insecurities, the fears, all of that isn't freedom. So I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in being free more than anything else. And so like those things, actually not so subtly, all just became like, you know what? That's just on the shelf. I don't have to deal with that because that's not important to me. I'm only concerned with freedom. So that's where my attention is. And the mindfulness practice that we did sort of made it so clear to me, like, oh, I've got all this stuff that like I am completely not accepting about myself. I don't want anything to do with it. Yeah. And then, starting to kind of embrace it, it's just a completely different thing. So that's a little, and it's like, so that's been very profound for me to experience that difference. And I want to talk about that, but I would like to hear from you about your understanding and experience of spiritual bypassing and why it is such an important topic to unpack, especially as one's getting into meditation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what you said I can relate to, and it was well articulated in the sense that I think in general, spiritual bypassing is when we're using any kind of spiritual practice to essentially skip work that needs to happen. Right. And it can happen really subtly or it can happen pretty overtly. But, I think there's ways that we can even deceive ourselves into sort of putting, as you said, putting things on the shelf and just saying, like, well, that doesn't feel great, so I'm going to skip that, or pedestalizing the special states, like you said.
Totally.
And really what we're doing there is sort of repeating a certain conditionality for ourselves that is going to keep us trapped. that there are certain states that are preferred and others that aren't, or some that are okay and some that are not okay and bad, and we don't look at. And with something like mindfulness, as simple and as quote like beginner of a practice it is, I mean, it never leaves as part of the path. It's always, but it's just, it strips everything nakedly. It takes all the toys away.
Right. Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of practices, and it's not that there aren't value in them, but when we're taking up certain practices and have skipped certain types of processing or looking at certain aspects or including aspects of ourselves, then they just become distractions. So it's not that those practices themselves are to be tossed entirely, but when you skip things first and go to them, like emptiness practice, it could be real easy to take certain insight practices, recognizing emptiness of self, recognizing emptiness of thoughts, emptiness of emotions, as a way to not deal with them at all.
Oh, yeah.
You just, oh, that's empty. And we're just dodging the whole thing. And you can, with any number of practices, you can experience those special states in any given moment, but there's a reason they're not stable.
Right.
The reason that they only pop up maybe momentarily or under certain very special conditions or something like that. And that's because all the rest of the karma, the habitual tendencies have not been dealt with. All right. So things like processing trauma or looking at our emotional reactivity patterns and looking at our relationship patterns and looking at the way we view and relate to ourselves, like those are things we need to look at directly and nakedly. And if we skip all that and just go like, well, those are all empty and it's ultimately just Buddha nature and none of that's real, we're trapped. We're just kicking that down the road.
Yes.
And so with mindfulness, we're not pushing things away. We're learning to relate to them very differently. So directly, non-judgmentally, with all the space, loving non-judgmental space in the world, right? I mean, one of the ways we might keep being conditionally loving with ourselves is by saying like, oh, there's no room for that particular emotion. Like imagine a relationship with somebody else, like who can't tolerate certain emotions that someone's displaying or certain experiences. So they shut them down, like directly or indirectly. So we learn to shut those things down in ourselves and find those not acceptable. So we got to sort of turn that relationship around and make room for all of it, like all the nooks and crannies, and be able to look at that directly and hold that in that non-judgmental loving space. So, there's just no way around it, but through it, with it.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it might not actually ever go anywhere, but the relationship with it all can transform incredibly.
Yeah.
Right. Like we shift from, maybe those automatic certain thoughts or emotions or things from my past continue to come up just from cause and effect habit. But instead of operating from that as being the autopilot driver of my experience, that's my basis of operation, right? I shift into a loving awareness of that thing coming up, including those things in the loving awareness and relating to them differently such that they still come forward, but that's not what's running the show anymore.
Right.
So it's not until we do that kind of stuff that then we can really look at the emptiness and see both sides of that coin.
Yeah.
Right. We can't just go into emptiness land. We have to deal with form too. It's not like that one is better than the other.
Yeah. You got to compost these things. Yeah.
I like how you said that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you said earlier, like, and I think this is like the heart of the thing. It's like, yeah, but how are you doing it at the dinner table with your family, Yeah. And I find all the grist for my practice comes through my family,
Yeah.
Like there's so much work there. And like, I've been, and when I'm using examples, when I'm teaching, that's what I'm pulling on. I'm pulling on my relationship with my wife and my relationship with my child and all the ways like that I'm getting triggered all the time. And to be honest, it's like that in the ways that you've been talking about, the mindfulness practice has given, and to your point, these things don't necessarily go away, but how I'm holding it is completely different. And, when I'm feeling the anger and I'm like in the past feeling conflicted about it, just feeling whatever triggered the anger, and then the shame and the, and the like confliction around feeling the anger. And, this just sort of like amplifying context or, around the shame and all of it. And then suddenly like, wait a second, dude, you're right in the middle of all this. Take a breath. I'm always amazed at the power of, in a moment, taking that breath and connecting to my practice and suddenly being on the inside of the breath and being on the outside of that reactivity. And suddenly there's a different choice available to me, in particular, just how I relate to it. And starting to consciously bring some of that loving attention, like, hey, all this is coming up right now. How about a little self-compassion? How about some maitri for myself, some loving kindness? And it's okay. It's actually okay that you're feeling this resentment towards your family members and that you have all this. You're not just a neurotic mess, and like having that space, it shifts. At what I found, it also shifts the ground from which I can speak about it with my partner. If I bring a little love to myself, then how I'm bringing it forward is completely different. I'm not coming from that place of resentment. And I have found that I found that to be very powerful.
I think you're bringing up something important here too about, this is not that shifts how we are with other people too. That's coming forward here is that, that kind of space that we're able to hold for certain aspects of our own experience and hold those lovingly helps us then also hold that for other people. And, when we're identifying from that loving awareness of those experiences, we can also identify that loving awareness in other people and not just see them for the top level experiences that are happening, that shift into the awareness, which it is now more into our natural state of mind, more into our Buddha nature, more into that unconditionally loving field, the potential to relate to things from that space and identify with it, versus identifying with all these reactivity patterns, all these defensive strategies that we've learned over lifetimes, all these maybe traumatic responses that we've learned, just all the automatic responses that usually that's our identity and that's who we think we are and that's where we're operating from. But that awareness shift right now is like all those things can be held in that loving awareness, and now a little bit more identified with that loving awareness field, which is our natural state of being,
right?
Underneath all the learning, and you can see that for other people. So it's like, I think that's always good sign of practice. If not that we're having special states going on, but that spontaneous, without really thinking about it, the way you are with other people is holding them in such a space that they can be more in their natural state.
Yeah.
Like whatever you're saying, doing, whatever body, speech, mind, our way of being is just spontaneously a solid match for whatever that person or people in front of you are needing to be held in that same way. Mm-hmm. And makes it a little bit easier for them to rest in that natural state, in that awareness. And we're not all interacting from each other's sort of reactivity or protective parts, or
totally, Yeah. Right. Yeah. You don't just, you're not just bouncing back and forth from, reactivity to reactivity.
Yeah.
I'm curious, so you're a psychotherapist. Do you feel like, I'm just curious about that relationship, and also maybe an example from your own experience, did you feel that your psychotherapy practice, that some of this was already very familiar to you? Like what we're talking about right now, kind of bringing that loving kindness to these disowned or broken parts of ourselves, the reactive parts of ourselves. Yeah. How have you experienced that? Like when you started doing this practice more, like, can you relate directly to what I was talking about? I mean, I love your commentary on it. Like, it's powerful how you articulated that, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you experience it personally in your life, and how it relates to your perspective as a psychotherapist, and if those two dovetail.
They definitely dovetail, and I was definitely on those learning paths simultaneously.
Yeah.
So in a certain way, I can't really separate them, and I think
that makes sense.
they're both traditions that have strengths in certain areas, and they go well together. Like, Western psychology gets into, developmental psychology or attachment psychology, not attachment in the Buddhist way of that word, but, the relational attachment.
Yeah.
And trauma is really well addressed and spoken about from Western psychology. And to my understanding, not so much from Buddhist psychology. However, Buddhist psychology, of course, talks about awareness and consciousness and the direct experience of our being in that ground Buddha nature in ways that certainly don't come up in Western psychology.
Right.
It's a little bit more around like developing that solid sense of self, like still from that dualistic perspective, right? Which is important and healthy, but it doesn't get into the non-dual side of things.
Right.
And I think they really complement one another, and as far as I don't know how to do therapy without some form of awareness practices on board.
Yeah.
Or without that in there. That doesn't mean, we're necessarily directly talking about Buddhism per se. It's different person to person, but we can sort of retrospectively talk about patterns that have happened and things like that. But unless we're able to watch, oh, look what's happening right now, I think it's hard to make a different choice.
Yeah.
Hard to, unless we're aware of like, oh, look how I'm relating to myself. Look how I'm relating to others. Like, look at the thoughts that are coming up. It's hard to change those patterns without recognizing them in the present moment. And those practices that help us develop present moment awareness are best articulated from Buddhist psychology versus Western psychology.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But then you couple, say, awareness practice or mindfulness practice with something like attachment theory or internal family systems, which are ways to articulate and maybe label all the different parts of oneself that are coming up and how they're relating to one another.
Yeah.
Right. They might not get into that kind of framework in Buddhism. They might just say it like that, that's a thought, or that's that's empty, or, you know what I'm saying? That's your emotion, but we can look a little bit more in detail to the relational patterns. I think it helps us recognize and make sense of what it is that when we bring that awareness on board, what is it that we're now aware of? Like, what are we witnessing?
Yes.
How did that come to be, and the cause and effect chain on that, right?
Yeah.
So I think they go well nicely together. I also think, with therapy, you are engaging directly in a relationship with somebody in such a way that, by bringing that unconditionally loving, non-judgmental space best we can to the room, we are doing an external version of what someone then internalizes.
Yeah.
Right. So it's interactive in that sense. And I think this can happen with teachers from.
That's great.
Right.
Yeah.
I think this can happen with our teachers from the Buddhist path, but the sort of direct talking about the pieces of the relationship. In my experience, that's not a particular focus. I think it happens, but it's not the practices you do on your own, ultimately.
Yeah.
Right. So not that we don't engage in those loving relationships with our teachers and Sangha members, but ultimately the practices are, it's okay. It's just you on the pillow. Like, no one can do this for you.
Yeah.
Right. So I think psychotherapy in some ways does an external version of what then moves internal. And then once it moves into that internal space, it maybe starts to get best articulated from Buddhist psychology.
Dude, I love that kind of that visual or that articulation, because that really does, it mirrors my experience very deeply when after our community fell apart. And like, I've talked about this on the show before, but it took about 2 years, and then suddenly like my body like was just like, dude, you're not okay. I started to have, I thought I didn't really know where I was, to be honest. It could be the littlest trigger, and it could be a Hallmark commercial. And I'd just start crying, and I'd be like, this is happening a lot. And I remember saying to my wife, I was like, I don't think I'm okay. And I think I need to talk to someone. And I started working with this therapist who did this combination of it was called core energetics is the modality, but it was this combination of like, some measure of talk therapy, but then also very somatic. Like, okay, we've kind of identified this thing. Now let's go into your body. Can you locate it in your body? And when eventually I'd locate it, and then she'd be like, all right, just stay there in that spot for a little while. And then she would just give me this prompt, like, is there a word or an image there? Often I couldn't even get the word out before I was sobbing,
Yeah.
And, I remember the first session we had, she had me that started, and she had me lie down on the floor, and she just put her hand on my heart. And man, I was just sobbing so hard. Like, just, there was so much grief. Yeah. And, for 2 years I worked with her. It was mostly, just grief. Started with just this sort of loss of the community and my teacher and my teaching and the sense of purpose. And like, I'd committed my entire life to that path and recommitted to it 1,000 times over those 14 years, but then when that whole space opened up, grief is, as it's just indiscriminate. So everything just started to come on the table. And the things that I didn't even know that I was grieving, I had no idea. And then they were just there. And I was like, oh my God, and yeah, I needed to let them go. I needed to cry. And that space with her, my therapist, as you said, over time, it became internalized so that I could just cry on my own. It was safe. And not only did it become safe, it became like cleansing and purifying. Like, I love to cry. It helps me so much, man. It just opens and softens my heart. And I have no shame about it. It's just so life positive, And I don't think we don't have that relationship. But I mean, to your point though, I was like, I love how you talked about, she held that external space, and over time it became my internal space.
That's a beautiful share, man. I appreciate you sharing it. And I can also relate, to just that transition from, I think we all, maybe not all of us, but many of us in different ways, just become disconnected, whether it's because of spiritual practices or it's because of traumatic experiences or the protective layers that come up, but we get disconnected from ourselves.
Yeah.
We get disconnected from our body. We get disconnected from our emotions. They're still there and happening, but we're just not giving them our time of day. And, it's almost like we both have kids. Imagine our kids coming to us and they've got something to say, they've got something to feel, and we're not giving them that space or time. Like, that's not going anywhere, and it's not going to get any better. Yeah. Right. So eventually that all needs its time of day, and it sort of piles up in our body. It piles up in our experience and starts influencing, like you said, like something has nothing to do with anything, all of a sudden sets us off, like whether it's sadness or anger or, something that's just fueled by layers of other stuff that have nothing to do with, the Hallmark commercial said. Yeah. And it's like all this stuff that needs the time of day, but we felt for whatever reason or another that it's not been okay or safe or it's not been okay to go there. Yeah. And I think for some reason, the thought, this is not universal truth, but this is true with a lot of men, right? Like, we're not, I think there's a beautiful shift happening away from this idea, but, experiencing and expressing emotion and vulnerability, right, is not necessarily a male pastime.
Right.
Right. And
For sure.
so, but I mean, that aside, I think any number of reasons for any of us, we've just felt like we can't go there. And then we can unlearn those protections. And sometimes that's through a relationship that is unconditionally loving and shows that example. That's like when I was talking about Lama Tsering, like he was that way. I wasn't quite ready for that, but he was that way. Sometimes we have those external examples. Sometimes we just start there by ourselves, and mindfulness practice is that too. Again, it's such a simple on the surface practice, but if we're actually bringing non-judgmental awareness to things that come up, we're starting to relate to ourselves in that loving way and allowing things to come forward we're not blocking them. We're not piling on. Right. And so we start to go there more and more. And then, I think sometimes it's really heavy at first. Like I had similar experiences that you expressed. And so sometimes it's really heavy at first and for a while, right?
Yeah.
And we're kind of releasing that backlog,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
But then once there is a finite amount there, right? It doesn't go forever like that.
Right.
And then we might get to a point where we're actually just like, we're dealing with things as they come now, not on top of the piles of undealt with shit.
Yes.
And so, maybe those things on the spot right here and right now we have stronger emotions but they're unobstructed.
Right.
And then when we're done, we're done. Like that, that's done with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we can tolerate that. And it's okay. And that's not, we're not putting that conditionality on ourselves. And we can also do that for other people and for our kids.
Yeah.
And for, and for just for anybody. We're not doing that conditionality to ourselves anymore. So that means we're not laying that trip on somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally, man. I love that. Part of this is I find that I'm less afraid in life, just period. I come from, there's a lot of alcoholism in my family historically. And, we're all, obviously this, working with people, like you come from a family of alcoholics, and you're constantly reading the room, right? And you're de-escalating left, right, and center, and you learn how to avoid conflict. And like all my siblings, we're all like super, like we'll avoid conflict and see it like 100 miles away. We're already kind of, managing that. And, all that conflict avoidant disposition, I think as my own heart has I've allowed it to be more just nakedly broken. I'm just less afraid of whatever comes up. Right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a new experience for me, just noticing like if my heart's broken, I don't really have anything to fear in this, because I'm like, I actually trust my own heart to help me navigate this stuff, and I don't have anything to hide. And that's it's just a different feeling and orientation. But yeah,
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
There's more spaciousness in it. It feels like more freedom.
Yeah.
Lack of fear means trust.
Yeah, trusting
our own heart and the situation, and that spaciousness for including that heartache. And, then you can be open to see that heartache in others and sort of that universal experience and not be afraid of it.
It's striking to me, man, like, okay, so, and recognizing it in others, like that you said, and that resonated for me, because at a certain point I was like, God, everyone's broken, everyone is so broken. And it's like when I kind of just saw more and more the depth to which like my own heart was broken. And I mean that in the best sense, and that it wasn't going to be unbroken. There was just going to be deeper levels to it, and learning, to live with a certain kind of bittersweetness and poignancy of like, oh, like the more you go through life, the more, you make mistakes, or you're burned and whatnot. And like, we're all making these large and small mistakes, and learning how to forgive ourselves for these things, and then bringing that context of loving kindness, there's just a rich bittersweetness to all of it. And like after I did this death and dying training a couple weeks ago at a local Zen center, and was like just ripped open from that experience.
I bet.
And it was so good, man. I was so like appreciated it on so many levels, but this sense of like, oh my God, it was this sense of like everyone's broken and we're all kind of in different relationship to that brokenness, but that, our culture does not really support us in this. There's that kind of assertion of a kind of, the toxic positivity, I guess, is one word for it.
Good vibes only.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas like in my experience, it's the opposite. Like the richness is coming from just letting it all be there and seeing myself and everyone around me a lot differently from that perspective. And yeah,
I think, what's come to mind is the first noble truth of suffering.
Yeah.
Right? And suffering, sickness, old age, death is part of the deal. And, I might use that language even more so than the brokenness only. I'm with you on what you were saying there, but I might just differentiate that in that, the orientation of calling it brokenness almost sounds like it's a little in the ballpark of that original sin bit. You know what I mean? But
yeah, that's a good point.
But I do think it points if the relative reality that there's no bypassing, right? There's no practices that it helps you see also ultimate truth, but we don't drop relative truth unless you're talking about full on enlightenment and Buddhahood after this life. During this life, we got the relative thing going on.
Yeah.
And if we got the relative thing going on, meaning we got this body, and as a result of this body, we feel separate from the world, then there's going to be heartbreak that comes with that.
Yeah.
Standard issue, right? There's just going to be heartbreak that comes with feeling separate from the universe. There's going to be heartbreak with having people who feel separate from us come and go and lose them, and that body's going to change and their body's going to change and go and be gone, and they're going to die. And that as long as we experience that, even though we might get familiar with ultimate as well, the relative is still part of the deal. And with that relative is going to come that heartache, and we can avoid that. We can bypass that. But it's still there. So if we do what you're talking about there in terms of bringing that close, like becoming more familiar and intimate with that experience of heartbreak and recognizing the universality of that in everybody else, as opposed to all these strategies to try to avoid it. It doesn't get us anywhere.
No.
We can warm up to this and learn how to have a very different relationship with it, not be surprised by it, and we've got more energy to hold it with understanding and with loving space. And that's different than dodging it or suppressing it or pushing it away or not even thinking about any of it, and again, repeating that sort of conditionality that says like only the good stuff is allowed, or only the good vibes, or like, you got to keep showing up only these ways, but not other ways. I mean, you see this not just in our relationships or in messaging, but, work environments. Like, it doesn't matter how you're doing or feeling, like you got to be productive. It's like, we're just kind of perpetuating that conditionality to one another, which is really what the trauma is, that it creates that disconnection.
Yeah.
It's arguably what trauma is, that disconnection, because we can't go there.
Totally, man. Yeah. I like that frame. I like putting that frame around it in terms of the first noble truth. And yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, and sometimes we focus on that first one and think like, well, that's just part of the deal. Like, but the rest of them also show how we can relate to that suffering differently. Right. As you know, and it doesn't just mean, we're just only focusing on suffering and it's all like depressing and drib from there on when we acknowledge that. But it's like there's by addressing that directly, we can find freedom in that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, you and we touched on this a little bit before the call, and you mentioned recovery early on. You have some experience in the context of recovery and addiction. Can you speak a little bit on to that in relationship to, like, how has that played into your practice? How has that, like, been a part of your own growth in terms of, you've been in recovery for this amount of time. Yeah. How does that shape your relationship to practice, who you are, how you show up?
If I rewind the tape on, how the not so healthy patterns began, it's hard to dial it into any one simple thing, but I can definitely see, like, a combination of being a fairly sensitive kid and, like, picking up on what other people are feeling and what's going on around me, and sort of not having the skill set to know what to do with any of that. It was all unmanageable, and I didn't have healthy ways of relating to that, and that manifests itself in anxiety and not knowing how to deal with the anxiety. There becomes that separation from ourselves. That it's like a survival pattern to disconnect with what we feel like we can't manage, and didn't attempt to do it deliberately, but it just turned out like, oh, when I drink, that anxiety goes away.
Yeah.
that works out, and that particular drug of choice is a pretty prevalent one in our society, pretty woven in, and it's an easier one to also justify and overlook how strong of a place it has in our lives because it's just so woven into the fabric of our society.
Yeah. Yes.
But it's a way to create this false sense of comfort and emotional management for short term, which it might arguably work short term, but kind of keeps kicking that unmanageability down the road, keeps that disconnection going, and, has other consequences that lots of times people don't want. And as I was starting to go through the recovery process, which started long before I stopped drinking, it was reconnecting with my body, reconnecting with emotional states, reconnecting with others intimately.
Yeah.
That started being like, okay, there are other paths. Like, this is doable. This is manageable. Like, I can, there are other ways to do this. Didn't even realize that that's how I was doing that.
Yeah.
I just knew that was, like, causing problems on occasion and needed to change. Like, I think there's the awareness that, like, that's what place it was holding in my life.
Yeah.
But once started kind of reconnecting, that became more and more apparent. It's, like, clearer what the cause and effect of things are, and what leads up to things and what comes after things. So shortly after my son was born, I just, like, woke up one day just not feeling good at all. It was useless, and it was just like something clicked, and there had been enough healing from other ways that it was like I was ready to let go of that relationship because there were other relationships that were healthier there now. Like,
yes,
a lot of people get into addictive patterns because that particular relationship is actually the most predictable, stable relationship.
Right.
Like, even if it's bad, it's like, I know what it's going to give me, and it's not a conscious thought, but it's just how it works, so you have to break up with it. and that helps when you've got other healthier relationships, including your internal one, to then move away from that toxic relationship, just like a person that's not a healthy relationship. And so, I think that reconnecting with ourselves, that developing confidence in our ability to manage our experiences, I think that's a common through line for people going through recovery, is that there had not been another way to do that per se presented, and this habit, or whatever habit it might be, is taken over. And I think there's something also universal about the notion of addiction that, like, while some people might have the relationship with particular substances, like, well, let's all take a look at how we, relate to our phone, or how we relate to, distractive media, or how we might relate to our work and our job. Like, these can just as equally be ways that we check out on life because life feels unmanageable.
Oh, yeah.
you know?
Oh
And,
yeah.
right. There's something in our society where, you know, we think of addictions in, you know, the particular veins and think of the substances, but really it's more pervasive than that, I hate to say.
I'm with you 100%, man.
And there are a lot of things that are sort of not only not in support of, but promoting our remaining disconnected from ourselves.
Yeah.
A lot of things that fuel our disconnection and continue us from being disconnected and benefit from us remaining disconnected, right? Like certain toxic work environments that you would have to be disconnected from the fact that you are not finding meaning from this and that you're exhausted and that you're totally stressed out. That's the only way you could keep doing that gig, for example, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you have to be cut off from yourself. So that addiction remains, you know?
Yes.
And there are some that are like, that's a socially supported addiction, you
Right.
know?
Right.
In learning to reconnect with myself and by way of connecting with others, you know, through that example and with meditation, learning to connect with the self, actual nature, not just those protective parts and coping strategy parts, which is what you identify with when you don't connect with true nature. That helped me and continues to help me in recovery and help others to reconnect with themselves and become familiar with what those strategies are and those protective parts are and relate to those differently.
Yes. Can you define for people, you use the word true nature there. Can you define for people what you mean by that in terms of connecting to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, with true nature, we can think of Buddha nature, we can think of bodhicitta, we can think of like an awakened heart mind. So we figure that, you know, there's the aspect of our mind that underneath and before all of our experiences of our habitual conceptual mind that remains, that's open, loving, spacious, that's not stained by all the aspects of our conceptual framework. You know, like figure we come into this world, we don't have the idea of being a separate self or like I'm Noel over here and that's everybody else over there. Like that develops over time. And we don't even have that conceptual framework to like 18 months. We're a little bit closer to that natural state of mind. And then we start learning on top of it. It never goes away, but the clouds start to develop. Like, okay, I guess I'm over here and I start to identify with this body. And then not only do I start to feel like a separate self and that dualistic perspective starts to develop, but there are attributes there are things I attribute to myself and qualities and characteristics and I have reactions to things that are out there and I say those are good, those are bad, and the conditionality starts to build like, oh, this is when Noel's quote doing a good job and this is when Noel's doing a bad job, or this is when Noel's lovable or not lovable. That conditionality starts to build. So all these things get heaped on top of this original goodness, so to speak, this Buddha nature, this potential for remaining completely awake despite the daydream of all of those thinking patterns that get developed. And even when they're happening, we can see through them as clouds. And we can think of original nature, true nature as the sun. This is a common metaphor. And it might be cloudy, it might be rainy, it might be nighttime, and we might seem like the sun's gone, but it's never really true. It's always there. It just might be obscured, or there might be something dark, you know, around it, but it's always there, you know. So, but we identify as those clouds. We identify as those. Like, I really think I'm the story of Noel that I've collected over the years. Right. That's like it feels like a really solid experience, even though I've never been the same body twice, never been the same mind twice, never been the same role or, you know, in relationships twice, but it feels really solid. Totally. So something underneath that delusional solidity, and that's our true nature of mind. And so that's like, I think really what healing is unlearning all that. It's not developing something new. It's not making more of that natural state of mind or that Buddha nature. It's just recognizing that it's always been right here and getting caught less and less in all the stuff that makes me think otherwise. Less and less into that conditionality. Less and less into those like ways we small ourselves.
Right.
And that's what healing is. It's not like, okay, someday if I just change up who I am, then I'll be better. It's like, no, it already is beautifully perfect underneath all the shit on top.
Yeah.
That clouds our experience. It doesn't even have to go away. We just have to recognize it for what it is.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, I feel like that might be a nice note to kind of start to wrap up on. And yeah, I think I just wanted to make a comment, because when you were talking about sort of all the manifestations of addiction and addictive behavior, recently I wrote about this in a post, but it was just, I was recognizing these ways. Implicit in what you were saying is all these ways we avoid relationship, right? And we disconnect. Again, this was just coming through my mindfulness practice, just seeing ways in which I was avoiding relationship as a parent with my child. Not everyone's obviously parents or has this experience, but I'm sure a lot of parents can relate to this. Is just when it just gets to be too much, right? And you're just like, I am done. I don't want to deal with this. But as a parent, you don't really have a choice in that. And also, depending on how well resourced I am and all sorts of things, the conditions for that are always changing. But I just would notice this way in which I would check out of relationship with her and go into a more two-dimensional sort of rules-based approach, where I'm not authentically really relating to my daughter, and knowing that she can feel that. And the mindfulness just started to kind of center that disconnect for me a little bit more, and being like, no, I can't just check out like this. And as hard as it is, and as much as I'm just like, I just want to get out,
Yeah.
It's like another one of those areas of disconnect that, instead of going on my phone or just doing, or even like just going and cleaning, anything but this, I started to, it's just the light of the practice starts to shine on all these things. And I have found that to be very illuminating. And, it's all of it's implicating, but in a way that I'm grateful for.
Yeah, man, kids, that's really is grist for the mill in my experience too. Just like, it's just the greatest mirror, right? Like, for like all the automatic stuff and the ways we kind of default and, are most challenged and everything, for sure. And like, man, they're just the best. The kids in our relationship to them, maybe relationships as a whole, but certainly kids.
Yeah.
Sounds like yours are like just the best teachers to really show us where it's at.
Completely, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Noel, thank you. Thank you for sharing so richly and deeply. And I know everyone on listening is going to get a lot out of this, and it's been really rich. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it, man. I appreciate what you do. Awesome. All right. Can you give people like a little bit of, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, connect with you, get on your mailing list, can you just share some stuff about, what's coming up for you and how people can connect? Sure. Yeah. So I'm on Instagram at Wake Up Sleepy Buddha. And I run a center called the Boston Center for Contemplative Practice. So it's thebccp.com. And that's where I post classes that I'm running, but also I host and support other teachers who teach different things as well, support them on the back end. So you can check out a bunch of different things that we run through there. I also work for Dharma Moon and their mindfulness meditation teacher training. They're at dharmamoon.com. So those are the main ways you can get a hold of me and see what we're up to. And at least everyone get on Noel's Instagram, because he posts some good stuff there, like some really great Dharma quotes. And, he also plays good music on there. You break out the guitar sometimes and sing soulful tunes. And I like what you put up there. Thanks, Morgan. Appreciate it, man. Yeah. All right, brother. Thank you so much. All right. So I hope you enjoyed my interview with Noel Coakley. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment to leave us a rating and a review on iTunes. I can't underscore enough what a big difference that makes for our exposure in the algorithm. on iTunes, and please leave us a rating and review. It's a big help. And just a reminder, if you're interested in starting a meditation practice, or if your meditation practice has lapsed and you're looking for some inspiration, I encourage you to join me for the upcoming Coming Home Mindfulness Meditation Training Program starting on February 8th. And we host these training programs. They're 5 weeks long. We meet once a week in the evening, and then there's an optional morning meditation Monday through Friday. It's a wonderful opportunity to kickstart your practice, add fuel to your practice, or if you've never meditated before, if you never had a daily practice, to do that, to start a practice. You can check that out over at aboutmeditation.com. Also, for listeners of the One Mind podcast, you can take an additional 20% off the sale price that's currently up there with the coupon code or the discount code OneMind23. It's one word, all one word. OneMind23. So just plug that in the shopping cart, and you can take an additional 20% off the cost of the course. So let's end with a quote. And today we're going to do one short and simple from Oscar Wilde, the poet. He says, "It is not the perfect, but the imperfect that is most in need of our love."